Welcome to The Adaptive Mind, where we talk with experts about practical, effective approaches to breaking habits and changing behavior. I'm your host, Brady Dowling. I'm glad you're listening. The Adaptive Mind is presented by Nurture, the #1 research-based app to help you break habits using self-compassion and science-backed methods. Find the link to install Nurture on iPhone or Android in the show notes. Thanks for joining this episode of The Adaptive Mind. Today, I'm talking with Matt Missar, and we're going to be talking about video gaming and kind of the addictive nature of that and some other things that go into that. So, Matt, I'm super excited for our conversation. Thanks so much for joining.
Of course. Yeah, I'm really excited to get into everything.
Awesome. So maybe to start off, I think I grew up with video games, and my parents did not. And there's probably a lot of kids or people that play video games these days who have someone else that just doesn't really get it. I know when I was a kid, my dad was always threatening to like cut the cord or I don't know, all this kind of stuff. So what makes video games so addictive, to use that word?
Yeah, so a couple different things. I think nowadays it's definitely one of the driving ones is the just overall game design. So the mechanics that are going into video games. The primary one being the variable reward system, essentially. So these are just different ways that kind of keep players engaged. So there's the variable ratio where, after a certain amount of actions, a player gets rewarded, but it's an unknown amount of actions, or a variable interval where it's an unknown amount of time, and then the player gets rewarded. And these mechanics are very similar to, like, if you wanted to think of like a slot machine, essentially, that variable reward system. I know I'm probably going to get rewarded at some point. I just have no idea when it's going to happen. And so that keeps a player coming back. It keeps them engaged and motivated to play. Other game design mechanics are like loot boxes. Are you familiar with the concept of a loot box?
Yeah, but maybe you can explain it still.
Yeah, sure. So a loot box is essentially like a virtual container that is an in-game purchase, or you get rewarded rewarded with it in a game, and it contains, a new weapon or some item that you can use in the game. But again, it has this variable reward system where I don't know what I'm going to get. It's essentially like pulling the lever on a slot machine. I'm opening this pack or this box and I get a random item. Sometimes it may be good. Sometimes it may just be a boring item. But again, it's that unknowing, not knowing what's going to be rewarded in it that again keeps players coming back for more. So those are like the actual like game mechanic designs that are keeping players engaged and addicted to video games. But there are other aspects like, just the social aspect of it. Sitting down and playing with friends, which is a good thing. But along with that comes the fear of missing out. Like what if my friends are all on and I'm not, or what if there's a special event going on in a game and I miss it and I'm the only one out of my friend group that misses it. That can be a really motivating factor for people engaging in video games to an unhealthy extent, especially, with certain age demographics. So if you're, 14 and all your friends are doing this one thing and you're not, that's going to be really motivating for you to want to engage in it as well. Maybe not so much as you get older, but again, it depends on, just different demographic variables. And then the last thing I think, with the addictive nature of video games is just the essentially portability of it, the accessibility of it. You can take video games wherever you want at this point, really. And so it's not just something that, okay, once I leave my living room or leave my bedroom, I no longer have access to it. I'm, taking a break from it. Now I can, be at school, be on the bus, be really anywhere and still have access to video games. That just, it removes that degree of separation where it's always with you at this point.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And I'm interested in talking about that accessibility later in our conversation. So we will put a pin on that and come back to it. I'm curious, working with your clients. So you do a lot of work with clients who maybe struggle with gaming use or some kind of behavioral challenge related to gaming. Can you talk about what is your general approach with your clients, how you work through something like that?
Sure. So yeah, so I'm a clinical social worker. So when a client comes to see me, it's still just, outpatient setting. And so we first start off with just like a general intake. So I want to kind of get a sense of what's going on in their lives, what their relationship with video games are like. Um, and so we do like a kind of general assessment to kind of meet them where they're at. Um, I first like to know kind of their motivation for even just kind of getting into treatment, getting into therapy, because that'll also tell you a lot about where they're at in the process of change. So if I ask someone and they're like, "Oh, it's just I'm here because my spouse or my parent wanted me to be here," it's going to be a little bit more challenging to get them to approach change because it's not something maybe that they want to do. But then if they say, "Oh, I realize, my relationship with gaming is getting to that unhealthy level, and I want to, start to change things up a little bit," then we can kind of get a sense of where they're at. Um, and then, getting a sense of their motivation for why they play video games in the first place. So, we kind of lump them into three different kind of categories. Um, the escaper. So like that's an escaper mindset where I play video games to escape from my day-to-day life. Maybe I'm not satisfied with how things are going in school or, my social network. And so I turn to video games to kind of escape from those feelings, emotions, and things going on. The second category is this like achiever mindset where I go into video games because I really like the competitive aspect. I really like leveling up, achieving things. And sometimes the individuals who fall into that achiever mindset often maybe can't get those things in real life. It's a little bit more challenging to level up sometimes. It's not as clear cut as it is in video games, especially once you get out of school. So once you get out of high school or college, which has like a relatively clear leveling up system. I have to study, pass this test, pass this grade, and then I graduate, get a diploma. But when you get into the real world, it's not that easy in a job. You don't really have those clear markers all the time of, okay, this is how I achieve this in my career. This is how I move forward. But in video games, that's all they are is here's, one checkpoint to get to. Here's the next one. Here's your reward for it. And so it's a much easier place to level up. It's a much easier and safer place to also fail. It's not really always the safest place to try and fail in the real world and deal with those repercussions. But in a video game, if I try and fail, I just restart the level or I get into a new game, and it's a little bit of a safer place to do that. And then the third motivation is kind of a combination of the two. We refer to it as like the hardcore gamer, where they both use it to escape and also to achieve, and they like that competitive aspect. So I really like to get a sense of like what their motivations to play video games are, because that can tell us a lot about what their how they got to this unhealthy relationship with video games, because it was filling some role, and I want to figure out what that role is that it's meeting or the needs that it's meeting.
Cool. Yeah. So it looks like you explore the motivation both on like why do you want to change if you want to, why are you
Right,
here?
right.
And then also kind of why do you like playing video games?
Right. Because that gives us a lot of information into then how do we approach treatment in terms of, do we take a more behavioral approach? Is it something that we focus on from a behavioral aspect in terms of like changing our environments and our behaviors? Or is it a more of an emotional thing where we have to explore kind of deeper coping skills and managing emotions that maybe video games are currently serving as a means to uh, be maybe not the best coping skills for people?
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned kind of this leveling up idea. Um, so do you see a lot of people kind of struggling more as they go from an achievement based environment and out into kind of a more ambiguous situation in their lives?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because it's just a lot less clear cut and it's not as obvious as to what I need to do. Um, Sometimes, we see a lot of like failure to launch sometimes where, clients just don't know what to do as the next step, whether it's after they get out of high school, after they get out of college, they just don't know really what to do. So yeah, they turn to video games because again, I can level up, I can achieve in that. And so yeah, it is a difficult thing for some people to kind of latch onto is that uh, you know ambiguity in terms of how to advance in, and again, not just like a work and career aspect, but just kind of sometimes life in general. Like what do I want my life to be next? What do I want to pursue next? And when it's not laid out for us as much as it is, in school. It becomes a little bit more difficult and daunting. And then to deal with that difficult and daunting feelings, we then turn to video games as a way to either cope or to distract from those feelings.
Right. Um, you also touched on kind of the safety of failure within video
Mhm.
games. And I'm curious if there is some specific way or kind of um, approaches that you use to help someone get out of that like super safe failure and kind of be either comfortable with failure out in the outside world or fail less, or kind of just what your approach is there.
Sure, that's where a lot of cognitive restructuring comes into play. So, in like our individual session, we'll really work through, what kind of irrational thoughts or dysfunctional thoughts am I experiencing when it comes to maybe that, fear of failure. Do I think that if I go and get a job and I'm not automatically promoted in a year, what does that say about me? And we really break down if there are any irrational or dysfunctional thoughts there and replace them with healthier and more functional thoughts. So yeah, really kind of exploring that cognitive restructuring of another one I really like to talk about is we have I mean, just humans in general have a very easy tendency to catastrophize, to plan for the worst, and that's a part of our caveman brain is always planning for the worst, preparing to keep ourselves safe. So we default to what happens if this goes wrong, and very often do we, or not very often do we ask ourselves, well, what happens if it goes right? So that's a kind of a cognitive restructuring exercise we'll do is, okay, if that's the worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario? And then where do we think the most likely case scenario will fall on that spectrum? And so just, some cognitive restructuring techniques that we'll do in session to try to push back on that fear of failure or whatever other dysfunctional thoughts the client may be experiencing.
Right. And perhaps the listeners are noticing this as well, but like a lot of the stuff that you're talking about is sure targeted to video gaming, but it can be easily generalized out to other things, whether
Mhm.
that's using alcohol to cope with social situations or like facing stress and anxiety about inviting people to go do something in a social setting, stuff like that. So I find it so interesting that um, with video games and really with anything, you can look at this kind of behavior or this situation and kind of other that person. But when you peel back the layers, it's actually quite similar to other situations.
Sure.
Um, so thinking about, I've used the term addictive a few times in our conversation. Um, is there a certain point when you would say like, yes, you are addicted to video games, or do you find that even relevant or helpful to kind of distinguish there?
It's a tough one. A lot of times when I try to stay away from using the term video game addiction, more so because of just the stigma behind it. So, not to without like not to go into like the whole history of gaming disorder and gaming addiction, but as it currently stands, um, as it's called, gaming disorder is only recognized currently by the World Health Organization in their it's their ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases. I think it's like the 11th edition. And so it's recognized there officially as gaming disorder. And then as opposed to in the DSM-5 by the American Psychiatric Association, they don't currently have it as a diagnosable disorder. They have it in their like needs to be further studied section. Um, so that's one reason. Not really the reason I don't tend to use the word addiction, but more often than not, it's the stigma associated with it. So I'll often have like clients come in and they're preteen or teenagers, and they come in and they go, yeah, those who are maybe a little bit more aware and motivated to change come in and say, oh, I know I have an addiction. I'm a video game addict. My parents tell me that all the time. And, again, a very small percentage of the global population and US population would even meet the criteria for a gaming disorder.
Hmm.
Um, and so when a client comes in and says that, what it's telling me is that they've been, there's this stigma in their household. Maybe that's because of a parent's perspective on video games. Maybe a parent has a really negative perspective on video games. So if they see their child having an unhealthy relationship, oh, you're addicted to this.
Mm,
When in reality, maybe it is just a problematic, unhealthy relationship with video games. Um, I typically think of video games on it, or healthy gaming, I guess, on a spectrum where it ranges from healthy to at risk to problematic to disordered. And usually, most of the clients I'm meeting with are falling in that problematic area where it's not so much you're meeting the criteria for a gaming disorder, but it's clearly impacting your life in some way and in some negative way, and it needs to be addressed. Um, so I think I tend to stay away from the word addiction just because of the stigmatization that it has for clients, but it does not mean that there isn't an unhealthy level that gaming can reach before that point.
right. And I would imagine that social media and TikTok culture has kind of maybe not exacerbated, but just kind of escalated the use of the word
Yeah.
addiction really in general.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, again, if not to say this definitively, but if a client has an unhealthy relationship with video games, more often than not, they have an unhealthy relationship with just on all online kind of forms of media. So whether it's social media, just watching YouTube, those kind of things, I see those all the time. It's usually never just video games, but kind of almost an unhealthy relationship with technology or screen time in general.
Yeah. And is there something that, like, is it important to you to be like, you know what? It actually is just video games, or it's like, it's actually everything. Like, is there a way that you figured that out, or is that even important and helpful?
Well, I think it's important just to know, like, if we're making behavioral changes and we want to address like how much uh, time spent, just on screens in general, or we just really focus on how much time spent playing video games. That can be helpful in that way. Um, but overall, it doesn't necessarily impact the nature of our therapy sessions because it kind of can again apply to all. Like if what we're talking about with video games and how to kind of have a healthier relationship with that, you can easily just apply that to how do I have a healthier relationship with social media or just all screen time slash tech use in general.
Yeah. Um, and I think even some of you feel free to correct me or expound upon this, but some of the things that we talked about that you mentioned for why video games are addictive in nature is like those things are present in other forms of technology. I think a long time ago, back when it was Twitter, there was this idea that the notification icon, there was like a variable reward system with that where you wouldn't know how long it would take for that thing to show up. And so
Mm.
even once you loaded the page, it wouldn't show right away. It would wait a little bit. And then after a while, you would see it and you're like, oh, nice. And you get this kind of like hit. So yeah, I think you probably kind of see some stuff in other pieces of technology as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're very similar. Like if we're comparing like social media and video games, they're very similar in that way. Again, that variable reward structure is very, very much the same. Maybe it's being displayed differently, but
Hmm.
that's another aspect that's, really bringing people back and motivating them to engage in those forms of media. Where they differ, I would say, is that video games are a more intentional is not the right word, but I would say, I guess, social media is more passive, whereas video games, I think you're more engaged, you're more goal oriented in most video
Hmm.
games in terms of, again, looking to achieve something or leveling up. Whereas in social media, yeah, it's much more passive, just scrolling, maybe again, looking for, the occasional like and things like that. But definitely similarities with the variable reward structure, differences, I would say, in terms of like the passive versus actively engaged aspect.
Yeah. I'd mentioned I grew up playing video games, and I don't really play like modern video games.
Hmm.
And so I noticed the difference in them. Like you talked about loot boxes,
Hmm.
several different pieces of it. It's like when I played Super Mario, there was a level and there was another level and there was another level. And video games now are just like completely different, both visually and in terms of the experience. And like you talked about, like there's this very intentional and you used a word that was good, but it was like almost in your face way of like, okay, this is a video game. This is not social media. Active. I think you said active and passive.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like it's really right there. Um, okay, so we talked a bit about how video games differ from social media and other pieces of technology, and then kind of how maybe current video games differ from video games of 20 years ago. Is there anything else that you'd want to touch on, and how video games now are different than maybe what people used to see?
Yeah, when I give presentations to a lot of different groups, but primarily when I'm talking with parents, I like to have this one slide that has a screen grab from the original Pac-Man, and then a screen grab from like a more modern video game, like an Overwatch or a Fortnite or something like that, to kind of juxtapose the two of them, because as you just said, kind of like the complexity, the visuals, all these things are so much different than a parent nowadays would understand with video games. Like it's just a completely different scene. Um, and so I think one of the major differences, and this again, it plays a role in maybe the addictive nature of video games, is uh, the I guess again, I'm trying to think timeline wise, but I'll just say a while back, video games used to be buy once, own forever. You go to the store, you buy a video game, or you maybe buy it online, but you own that video game, you play through it, and it's got a very distinct end. You can obviously go back and replay the game, but it has a very distinct end point. Whereas nowadays, a lot of games, or a lot of more of the popular games, are free to play with in-app purchases, in-game purchases instead, and they don't have that end point. They're games that are constantly evolving. There are constant updates, constantly having new features, which again is just a way that's going to keep players more engaged, more motivated to come back. There is no just distinct endpoint to those games. Um, as we talked about earlier, like the social aspect of it is also way different. Like when you and I were younger, to play video games with other people, usually you had to have them come over to your house to play video games. Now I can play with someone on a completely different continent, and it's just easy. And so there's that. The social aspect of it's different. Um, but yeah, I think just I'm sure we'll get into kind of parent perspectives and stuff like that, but that's a big one that's often a roadblock for parents, is they just don't get video games. Even if they played video games when they were younger, they're just so different now that the perspective's just different on it. It's like, how are you playing video games for 8 hours? I would get bored playing Pac-Man for 8 hours. Well, they're not playing Pac-Man. They're playing these games that are designed to keep them engaged for long periods of time. So yeah, there's a significant difference, even within the past couple of years of video games compared to their older generations.
Yeah. So yeah, you touched on parents. Let's go into that just a little bit.
Mhm.
So I know there are, parents that are like, you should stop playing video games. Um, so I kind of have two thoughts. One is this idea of abstinence versus
Mhm.
healthy gaming. You've used that term, healthy relationship. So I want to touch on that in a second. But I think, how might a parent initiate this conversation without, pushing their child away, maybe, or kind of hardening the child's stance? Yeah. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I always ask parents to first analyze their own perspective, like question their own perspective on how they view video games. Um, and that's not with the purpose of trying to convince parents to have a positive perspective all the time on video games, because they just might not, and it's tough to try to force them to, oh, video games are great, you should really enjoy them, and you should really like that your child's playing them. It's sometimes a tough sell for parents, but what I at least try to push them to is at least a neutral mindset, a neutral perspective on video games. The last thing we want is for them, if they have a negative perspective on video games, is to let that negative perspective kind of run wild. Because if I already go in not liking video games, thinking they're a waste of time, how am I going to have a healthy conversation with my kids about video games if I already have such a negative connotation about them in my mind? So I try to challenge parents to push or to kind of challenge their own perspective and their own view on video games. To at least be neutral, where you can recognize that, video games have a place in time. They do have benefits, but there also, are those negatives if it, becomes again to that unhealthy uh, relationship or that imbalanced relationship. So kind of analyzing their own perspectives in order to have that healthier conversation. And then just being curious, just asking your kid about the video games they play, why they play them, what they like about them. Again, from a neutral or positive perspective. You don't want to go in with that negative perspective of why are you playing video games in such a judgmental way. So I think this is from Ted Lasso, and then Ted Lasso probably quoted it from someone else that be curious, not judgmental. I think that applies beautifully to when you're having conversations about video games with your kids. You want to be curious about it. You want to learn about it because that you want to form an alliance with your kids. You don't want to be competing against them. I'll use the analogy like be a coach, not a referee. You really want to be, in collaboration with them rather than being the ref who's, penalizing them every single time they make some mistake. You want to be able to work with them when they do have a mistake. You acknowledge it, but you kind of grow together. So being a coach, not a referee in that instance.
Okay, cool. And then thinking about kind of like the end goal.
Mhm.
Do you think that abstinence is like favored over moderation, or yeah, what's kind of the relationship and your thought process there?
In my opinion, abstinence can work, but more for those very severe cases, probably. Uh, in my own clinical work, I rarely will take a total abstinence approach just because I don't think it's sustainable.
Hmm.
So I really focus on that healthy gaming. We call it, a more clinical term, a harm reduction approach, where our
Okay,
goal is to reduce gaming harm. So again, ultimately, how do we create a healthy balance with gaming? Because I think one that's more sustainable and it's more realistic. So if I'm going into a session with a 14-year-old who's got an unhealthy relationship with gaming, I'm not going to tell him, hey, the way to get better at this is to never play video games ever again. It's just not going to work. So what I want to do is work with them, setting up appropriate goals where we're creating a healthy relationship, a balanced relationship with video games rather than just trying to remove video games completely from the picture.
got it. Cool. Um, so thinking again about how you work with your clients beyond sessions with your clients, are there any tools that you're recommending or encouraging clients to use, like journaling or apps or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of different things. So I'll recommend like podcasts to listen to and stuff like that if they need kind of just additional resources. But in terms of apps, honestly, like a really bare bones like habit tracker can be really good. A timer, if we're talking like behavioral changes, a timer is really good of just how much time I'm actually spending on video games. That's one of like the first homework assignments I'll give a client is spend this week logging your amount of time spent playing video games or on social media, because very often we have a very skewed and biased view of how much time we're actually spending on these. So like I'll always have them make like a prediction of what it's going to be when they come in. And oh, I only play like 4 hours of video games a day, and then they'll come back with their log and it's like 8 hours of video games every day, and it's like, okay, maybe we weren't as accurate in our heads as we thought. So yeah, just like kind of some timers and stuff like that. I think the Nurture app's great. Plug that. I think that just apps that kind of can focus on overall well-being as well. So like even if it's like a meditation or like a journaling app, just something that can give them some a chance to reflect, and just kind of be mindful and encourage those things, can be beneficial as well.
Okay, awesome. Um, I just have two quick questions for you. One is, what makes for a healthy relationship with video games?
I think if I'll pick two words. I know you didn't tell me to pick two words, but I'll pick two words. Intentionality and balance. So I think intentionality in terms of making the intention. If I'm going to play video games, it's because I'm intentionally deciding I want to play video games, not I'm just doing this passively to kill time because I don't have any other options or I haven't thought of any other options and I'm just like mindlessly putting on video games. No, I'm making the intentional decision to play video games. And then I think balanced in terms of, having it be part of our routine, part of our schedule, but not building our schedule and routine around it. So I've got school, I've got other activities going on, other hobbies I enjoy. Really leaning into like social connection as well, because that's something that often falls off first sometimes when we get an unhealthy relationship with video games. So making sure we're maintaining friendships, relationships with family members. So kind of keeping that overall balance in terms of just having other activities that are built or that video games can be built around, but aren't being built around video games. So yeah,
Okay.
intentionality and balance, I think I'd say.
Okay, awesome. And then last one is, what would you tell someone right now who's maybe struggling with their video game usage?
Be kind to yourself. I think, when you get that awareness of, okay, my video gaming has gotten to an unbalanced, unhealthy point, we can often be very negative towards ourselves. So, like, being kind and recognizing that this is something that a lot of people go through. Like we talked about, video games are designed to do this. The people who are making video games are trying to design them to keep you gripped as long as possible. And I would also say just talk with someone. It doesn't have to be, a licensed therapist right away. If it's just kind of talking with a friend about it or talking with a parent about it, that can always be really helpful because you're not keeping it locked in, locked to yourself of like, oh, I'm really going through this, but I don't want to share it with anybody. I know it can be tough, but kind of having that conversation with a friend, a family, and then, maybe getting connected with a professional can be really beneficial.
Okay, great. And where can people find you if, let's say, they want to get connected with you?
Sure. So I'm sure we can plug like my email and stuff like that, and people just can reach out via email. I'm a clinician at a private practice group called the Better Institute, so you can find me on their website, betterinstitute.com. And you can read through all my profiles. We got a bunch of resources for parents and gamers about just healthy gaming. We also have a couple online courses called the Powered Up courses, Powered Up Player and Powered Up Parent. Just again, just self-paced things to provide education for both parents and gamers about healthy gaming.
Awesome. Great. Well, that sounds great. I'll make sure to include those in the show notes. And thanks so much for the conversation, Matt. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. This was great.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Adaptive Mind, brought to you by Nurture, the research-based app for overcoming unwanted or addictive behaviors. I hope you found our conversation insightful and inspiring. If you did, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing these learnings to people that need them. Remember that you have an adaptive mind that does incredible things every day, and it's capable of even more. We'll see you in the next episode.